They called her number 47. Not because she was the 47th prisoner. There were far more than that in the lower levels. She had counted the moans in the dark during her first week, mapped them the way a blind person maps a room, by sound and duration and the direction of echoes. No, they called her 47 because that was the classification code the Velkari overseers had stamped into the intake ledger. Category 4, subdesignation 7, expendable labor, low cognitive yield, unsuitable for direct service. Suitable for dungeon detail until biological termination. She was 16 years old. Her name was Sira. She had not said it aloud in 4 months. She had learned early not to say her name. The first time she had told it to a guard, a young one, newer than the others, his translator node still blinking calibration orange. He had looked it up, cross-referenced it. His expression had changed from the flat bureaucratic blankness they all wore into something different, something that meant trouble. He had flagged her file. The overseer came down 2 days later with a team, and they took the woman in the cell next to Sira's. The one who had given Sira her name in the first place whispered through the grate, "My name is Allah, what's yours? What's yours?" They never brought Allah back. So Sira became 47. She answered to it. She practiced the correct inflection in the back of her throat, the way the Velkari vocalized numbers, a short click before the 4, a falling tone on the 7. She got good at it. She got good at a lot of things the aliens expected her not to be capable of. That was the first thing she understood about the Velkari. They had read everything about humanity in their data stores, calculated every human metric, ranked every biological capability, and had concluded, with the comfortable certainty of a civilization that had subjugated 32 other species, that they already knew everything worth knowing. They were wrong, but they did not know they were wrong, and that was the gap she intended to crawl through. The dungeon was not actually underground. This had surprised her in the beginning. The Velkari word that translated to dungeon really meant something closer to inactive processing facility, a place where materials of low current value were stored until a use was determined, or until they decomposed on their own, whichever came first. The facility was inside a vast cliff face on the outskirts of what had once been the city of Ren, carved into the rock by some older civilization's tools, expanded by the Velkari with drilling machines that left the walls glassy and faintly green. It smelled of mineral water and something biological that Sira had eventually identified as the secretion of the bioluminescent fungus that grew in the upper ventilation shafts, a faint blue-green glow that reached the cells as barely more than a suggestion of light, enough to see shapes, not enough to read, not enough to work. That had been the first problem she solved. The fungus shed spores. If you gathered enough of them on a flat surface, she used the underside of her meal tray, which she had pried loose from its magnetic anchor on her third night, and cupped it at the correct angle. The collective glow was just bright enough to cast readable light across a surface held 6 inches away. It took her 2 hours to figure this out. It took her another week to gather enough sporefall to make it reliable. She used it to study the walls. The Velkari didn't think their prisoners could read their script. It was a reasonable assumption. Their language had not been in any human database before the occupation. But language, Sira had learned in the years before her capture, was not just a code to crack. It was a pattern, and patterns were what she did. Her mother had been a linguist. Her father had been a computational engineer. Sira had grown up in a household where dinner conversation regularly drifted between 3 languages, where her parents argued about the phonemic drift in Mandarin loan words, with the same heat other families used to argue about sports. Before the Velkari came, she had been enrolled in the Sciences and Linguistics dual track at the Aneth Academy. She had been, her instructors said, exceptionally gifted. The Velkari did not know any of this. Her intake file listed her as female, juvenile human, North Continent urban origin, non-specialist, category 4, Subdesignation 7. The flag on her file, triggered by that first guard before she understood the rules, said, "Possible minor noble status monitor." And then nothing. The flag had sat there, unresolved, for 4 months, because the overseer who had taken Allah had concluded that Allah was the dangerous one, not the quiet 16-year-old in the next cell who never spoke and did not make trouble. This was the second thing Sira understood about the Velkhari. Their bureaucracy was vast, and their bureaucracy was slow, and their bureaucracy had the particular weakness of all vast, slow things. It assumed that anything it had not yet noticed was not worth noticing. She had been studying the wall inscriptions for 6 weeks when she made her first translation. Not a full sentence, a word, a single Velkhari word that she had seen repeated in 3 different contexts, always preceding what appeared to be a list. Designation. She wrote it in spore dust on the inside of her wrist. She stared at it. She thought about the way the overseer's voice had moved when he spoke to his subordinates, the click at the front of certain words, the way pitch functioned in place of what humans would use as suffix inflection. By the end of the 2nd month, she had 14 words. By the end of the 3rd, she had 63, and she had begun to understand the grammar. She did not tell anyone, not because she didn't trust the other prisoners. There were 8 remaining on her level, and she had cataloged them all through the great whisper network that still functioned in the deep hours between the guard rotations. She knew old Fenwick, who had been a bridge engineer and who spent his days in a fugue of quiet despair, so deep it was almost peaceful. She knew the twins Davy and Lyra, who had been agricultural workers and who still, 4 months into imprisonment, refused to believe they would not be released, because they had done nothing wrong. She knew Scene, who had been a physician and who had made herself useful to the Velkhari as a biological consultant, and was therefore fed better than the rest of them, and was slowly being consumed by the guilt of this fact. She knew Brackett, who had been a soldier and who was the only one who never spoke through the grate, not because he was broken, but because she was fairly sure he was thinking, like her. She did not tell them about the translations because knowledge in this place was currency, and currency spent too early was currency wasted. She was saving it. She did not know yet for what. The answer came on a Tuesday. She had been keeping track of days with a system of thumbnail scratches on the stone beside her sleep mat. The Velkhari had no concept of weeks, which was useful because it meant their patrol rotations were based on a 19-unit cycle, not a 7-unit one, and there were therefore predictable gaps in coverage at certain intervals that humans on a 7-day internal clock would not naturally notice. She had noticed. She had been mapping the gaps for 3 weeks. On that Tuesday, the overseer came to her cell. Not a junior guard. The overseer himself, heavy-framed, his translator node a permanent installation rather than a clip-on, his classification markings running up the left side of his neck in the gradient blue that Sira now knew indicated senior administrative authority. He stood outside her cell and he looked at her, and then he looked at something in his hand, a handheld device of some kind, and then he looked at her again. He said something in Velkhari. She understood most of it. She did not let this show on her face. Number 47, his translator rendered in flat mechanical English, a half-second after the original. Your file has been reviewed. Your origin classification has been escalated. You will be reassigned. She said nothing. She kept her face at the expression she had practiced, neutral, slightly dull, the expression she imagined a Category 4, Subdesignation 7 would wear if they had no particular inner life worth mentioning. She was good at this. She had been good at it for months. "Do you understand?" the translator said. "Yes," she said. She was taken up 2 levels. The cell they put her in was larger, the walls actual stone rather than drilled rock, with a functioning light fixture and a window, a narrow vertical slit cut through 3 feet of cliff face, through which she could see a stripe of sky the color of old bronze. There was a sleep platform rather than a mat, a waste facility that functioned, a meal delivery system that beeped rather than clanked. She stood in the middle of the cell for a long time, not touching anything, cataloging every detail. Then she sat on the floor, not the platform, the floor in the center of the room, and she began to think. Reassignment. The word had a technical meaning in Velkari administrative structure. She had seen it on the walls of the lower level in context, materials reassigned from inactive processing to active function. She was being moved from storage to use. The question was, what use? She knew the answer by the next morning, when the junior administrator arrived with a data tablet and a list. "You will be working in the archive facility," the translator said. "Your function will be maintenance. You will receive training. You will not speak to other workers unless spoken to in the performance of your duties. You will not touch any archive material beyond what is assigned to you. Violations result in immediate reclassification to Category 7. She knew what Category 7 meant. She had read it on the wall. She kept her face neutral. "Understood," she said. The archive was not what she had expected. She had imagined something cold and administrative, rows of storage units, filing systems, the Velkari equivalent of a records room. What she walked into was something that took her breath away so completely she had to cover it with a cough. It was a memory. That was the only word for it. The archive was a room the size of a small stadium, carved into the heart of the cliff, and every wall was covered in data panels running live simulations, not recordings, not static images, but live, interactive reconstructions of the past. The room smelled of electricity and something organic, something she couldn't identify, faintly sweet and slightly wrong. The other workers, a dozen of them, all human, all adults, all moving with the particular economy of people who had learned to make their bodies very small, barely glanced at her. They moved between the panels with small tools, doing something she couldn't immediately identify. The administrator led her to a panel near the far wall and showed her. The Velkari had been collecting human cultural data for 2 decades before the occupation. Everything: broadcasts, written records, visual media, commercial archives, network data, everything. They had reconstructed it into a searchable immersive database, a living record of human civilization that their researchers and administrators could walk through and examine. It was, in a way, the most complete archive of human history ever assembled. But it was full of logos. Brand symbols, copyright marks, commercial identifiers embedded in thousands of years of human media, layered into every broadcast, every recorded image, every document. The Velkari had discovered that these marks were proprietary, connected to commercial entities that had filed legal challenges through the interspecies tribunal processes the Empire nominally maintained. The marks had to be removed from the archive, manually, one at a time. The archive workers were the ones removing them. They were ghosts in their own history. They moved through reconstructed versions of human streets, human buildings, human broadcasts, and they erased a logo on a sign, a brand mark on a piece of clothing, a corporate identifier on the side of a vehicle. They moved through the simulation with small digital erasure tools, and they removed the marks, and then they moved on, and they never interacted with the history they were wading through. Just deleted the marks and kept moving. Sierra stood in front of her assigned panel and she looked at the tool they had given her, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not despair, something colder and more useful. Because she understood something the other workers did not. When you erased a mark from the archive, the erasure was logged, tracked. The tool generated a record of every deletion, where, when, what, and the deletion records were filed in the administrative system. And the administrative system was the same system whose language she had been learning for 4 months, whose logic she had been mapping, whose structure she now understood better than any human in this facility, possibly better than some of the junior Velkari administrators who worked here. She picked up the tool. She found her first logo, a department store chain from the early 21st century, its mark embedded in the top corner of a Street View reconstruction. She deleted it. She watched the log entry generate. She began to smile. She made it stop before anyone could see it. 6 weeks in the archive. 6 weeks of moving through her own species past, erasing the commercial marks of dead corporations from a record that would be used by alien researchers to understand what humanity had been. 6 weeks of the other workers not speaking to her, except to indicate when she was in their way. 6 weeks of the administrators walking past her without slowing down, because she was Category 4, reclassified, yes, but still low, still expendable, still the quiet girl who did her work and made no trouble and had no particular inner life worth noticing. 6 weeks of learning the deletion log system. The log entries were not just records. They were linked. Each entry connected to the administrative file of the archive segment it referenced, which connected to the processing record for that segment, which connected to the oversight record for the archive facility, which connected. She followed the chain with the same patient, meticulous attention she had given to the wall inscriptions, the guard rotations, the patrol gaps, to the facility management system. The facility management system controlled the cells. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she was sure. She checked her understanding against every piece of Velkari administrative language she had accumulated. She tested it in the margins of the log entries, in the small notations she was technically permitted to make regarding the condition of corrupted archive segments, encoding her checks in a cipher that was not a cipher at all. It was a bilingual pun, a piece of linguistic sleight of hand that would look like standard archive notation to any Velkari reader, and that she had constructed specifically to exploit the gap between how their grammar handled possessives and how hers did. She was, she thought, perhaps the only person in this facility doing anything interesting. The other workers did not speak to her. They did their work and ate their meals and slept their hours and did their work again. Old Fenwick was not here. She had glimpsed him through a grate on her way up, still on the lower level, still in his fugue. Brackett was not here. She did not know where Brackett was. She thought about him sometimes in the deep hours, wondered if he was still thinking. She did not try to explain what she was doing to the others. She had thought about it. The physician scene was also in this section. She had spotted her on the 3rd day, and she had thought that scene, with her quiet, guilty competence, might be capable of being useful. But useful in what direction? Toward what end? She did not yet know what the end was. She had a capability. She did not yet have a plan. The plan arrived on the 43rd day in the archive, in the form of a junior administrator who was angry. He came in during the 3rd work cycle, moving quickly, his neck markings bright with stress color. She now knew that the Velkari chromatic response in their markings was involuntary, biologically honest in a way their faces were not. He went straight to the senior archive overseer, and they had a conversation she was positioned to overhear, her panel being the nearest one to them. She caught most of it. There was a prisoner on level 9, the deepest level, the one below where she had been, the one nobody came back from, who had been reclassified. The reclassification had been triggered by a flagged file. The file had been flagged because of a notation in an intake record from 4 months ago. The notation said, possible minor noble status. The junior administrator was unhappy because the reclassification had generated an inquiry from the Interspecies Tribunal's Human Advocate Office, and the Empire did not currently want inquiries from the Human Advocate Office, because negotiations were ongoing and appearances needed to be maintained. He was saying that the prisoner needed to be processed before the inquiry arrived. Processed, she knew that word. She did not let her hands shake. She kept her tool moving. She deleted a brand mark from a 22nd Century Street sign, and she said nothing, and she felt something solidify in her that had been liquid for 4 months. A cold, hard, very specific thing. They were going to kill someone on level 9. They were going to do it before the advocate's inquiry could arrive. They were going to do it to clean up a flag in a file that had been sitting unresolved for 4 months. A flag that had been triggered by a single conversation through a cell wall grate. A woman whispering, "My name is Allah, what's yours?" Sierra did not sleep that night. She sat with the deletion tool in her hand. She had not returned it. A minor infraction she calculated would not be noticed for at least one more work cycle, and she worked through every piece of the administrative system she had mapped. She drew it out in spore dust on the floor of her cell, connecting the branches, testing the logic, finding the places where one level of the system touched another. The cells on level 9 were managed by the facility management system. The facility management system had a maintenance protocol that allowed cell environmental controls to be overridden from an administrative terminal. The archive deletion log terminals were administrative terminals. The connection was indirect. It required 3 separate authorizations, each one a small notation, each one individually innocuous, each one carrying a slight repurposed meaning that would look like standard archive maintenance procedure to any Velkari reader who did not understand how she was using the gap between their grammar and hers. She had built the cipher specifically for this. She had built it 6 weeks ago, without knowing what she would use it for, the way you sharpen a tool before you know what you'll need to cut. She went to work the next morning. She sat at her panel. She moved through the archive. She was working in a section from the early 21st century today, a reconstruction of a city street, signs and vehicles, and people who did not know they were being watched by an alien civilization centuries after their deaths. She deleted logos. She made her maintenance notations. In the margin of the first notation, she encoded the first authorization. In the margin of the fourth, she encoded the second. She waited 2 hours before she encoded the third. She wanted to be sure. She wanted to check every branch of the logic one more time, trace every connection, verify every assumption. She thought about her mother and the way her mother had always said, "The difference between translation and mistranslation is the moment of doubt just before you commit. Don't skip it." She did not skip it. She encoded the third authorization in the margin of a notation about a corrupted logo on the side of a vehicle she didn't recognize, and she sat with the tool in her hand, and she waited. Nothing happened, nothing visible happened, that was the point. 3 levels below her, on level 9, in a cell whose environmental controls had just been quietly reset by a maintenance override generated through an archive deletion log, the temperature dropped 2 degrees. The ventilation cycle shifted. The door lock registered a fault, not an open, not an unlock, just a fault, the kind of minor mechanical error that the facility management system was programmed to flag for physical inspection before escalating to security. A fault required a maintenance technician, not a guard. A maintenance technician had access to the corridor. A maintenance technician was not a threat response. A maintenance technician was Category 3 labor, the same category as the archive workers, and in the 47 minutes between a fault being flagged and a technician being dispatched, the cell door would remain in fault state. Locked, technically, but with the secondary magnetic seal disengaged. She did not know Allah. She had heard her voice 6 times through a wall grate. She did not know if Allah was still capable of understanding what the door state meant, or if 4 months in level 9 had consumed everything. But she had done what she could do. She had done it with the only tools she had. She had done it invisibly, in the language of the system that held them, in a grammar that was not hers, using a gap between 2 ways of understanding possession and ownership that a 16-year-old girl had found in the walls of a dungeon by the light of spores. She deleted another logo. She kept working. An hour later, the administrator came in, not the angry junior one, a different one, senior, his neck markings neutral. He walked the length of the archive to the senior overseer and they spoke quietly. Sierra could not hear them from her panel. She watched them in her peripheral vision. She kept her eyes on her work. The administrator left. The overseer returned to his station without expression. She did not know if it had worked. She would not know for days, possibly weeks. News moved slowly in the facility, filtered through great whispers and the rare crossed glances of workers in the corridor. She would have to wait. She was good at waiting. She had been practicing for 4 months. What she knew was this: she had acted. She had done something that was not waiting, not enduring, not making herself small and dull and unnoticeable enough to survive another day. She had done something that required everything she was: her mother's language, her father's logic, 4 months of patient study, 6 weeks of meticulous mapping. And she had done it so quietly that no one watching would have seen anything except a girl deleting logos. This was what it meant to be human in the Velkari facility. Not strength, not numbers, not the ability to fight the thing that held you. The ability to look at the system that held you and find the gap it didn't know it had. She thought about the other workers, the way they moved through their own species' history like ghosts, erasing the commercial residue of a civilization that was gone, doing their work and eating their meals and not speaking. She understood them. She did not blame them. Endurance was not nothing. Endurance was how you survived until there was something to do. But she had found something to do, and she had done it, and something in her chest that had been held tight for 4 months had quietly let itself breathe. The days after the act were the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, nothing visibly went wrong. The work continued. The administrators walked past. The other workers deleted their logos and did not speak. Sira moved through the reconstruction of the 21st century and erased the marks of dead companies and tried not to think about level 9. She tried not to think about Allah. She tried and she failed, and she thought about her anyway. About the sound of a voice through a grate in the dark, offering its name like a gift. My name is Allah, what's yours? She thought about the trust that gesture had taken, in a place where trust had already cost so much. She thought about the fact that Allah had not known Sira at all, could not have known if Sira was worth trusting, could not have known if Sira would protect the gift she had given. She had just offered it anyway, because it was dark and she was afraid, and connection was the only thing that pushed back against both of those things. Sira thought that Allah was probably the bravest person she had ever met. On the 8th day after the act, Scene found a reason to pass near her panel. She was carrying a replacement tool, the ordinary movement of archive maintenance work, nothing unusual. She paused near Sira's station, not looking at her, her eyes on the panel she was ostensibly examining. She said very quietly in the space between one tool motion and the next, "Level 9. There was a transfer before the processing order was executed." She kept moving. Sira kept her face still. She deleted a brand mark from the side of a product she didn't recognize. She breathed very carefully through her nose. Allah was alive, somewhere, not on level 9, not processed. She did not let herself feel it fully yet. There were too many ways this could still go wrong. A transfer was not freedom. Being alive was not the same as being safe. And she was still here in this facility, in this cell, with her fake name and her practiced blank face and her secret, building towards something she still could not quite see the shape of. But she had moved a piece. She had moved a piece, and the board was different. She held on to that. The winter came. She knew it from the stripe of sky in her cell window, the color changing from old bronze to a gray that seemed to press against the glass. The work continued. She kept studying. She was in the Velkari administrative language, past basics now, past vocabulary and grammar, into something harder and stranger: idiom. The way the administrative language carried cultural weight in the spaces between official meanings. The way a particular construction signaled that a directive came from political pressure rather than procedural logic, which meant it could be challenged on procedural grounds. The way another construction meant the opposite of what it literally said. in a specific bureaucratic context that the Velkari called the face register, the formal mode used in communications intended for the interspecies tribunal. The interspecies tribunal. She had heard the administrator mention it. She had been thinking about it ever since. The tribunal was not powerful. She knew this from the little she'd been able to piece together from overheard conversations and the margin texts in the archive. It was a political construct, maintained by the Empire as a way of managing relations with the 17 species currently under occupation, giving them a formal mechanism for grievance that cost the Empire almost nothing to provide and gave them the appearance of due process without its substance. The Human Advocate Office was a small team of 3, underfunded, overextended, and largely ignored. But it existed. It had generated an inquiry once already, the inquiry that had been the direct cause of Sira's act, an inquiry the Empire had wanted to avoid because negotiations were ongoing. She began to think about what it would take to generate another inquiry, and another, and another. Not an escape, not a rebellion, not the things that would get people killed. Something smaller. Something quieter. Something that worked the way she had been working in the margins, in the gaps, in the language of the system itself. She thought about Scene, who had been a physician, who was guilty, who was useful. About old Fenwick, who had been a bridge engineer and who was in a fugue but who, she suspected, had still kept his technical knowledge the way you keep a thing you love even after the thing no longer seems relevant. About Brackett, the soldier who never spoke through the grates but who was thinking. She began, very carefully, to reach out. Not fast, not all at once. She took weeks. She used the Great Whisper network she had been part of for months, and she used it in the way she had learned to use every tool the facility gave her, patiently, indirectly, in small notations that looked like one thing and meant another. She did not tell them what she was planning. She did not tell them she was planning anything. She just started asking questions that led somewhere. She asked Scene about the tribunal's medical reporting obligations. Scene answered cautiously, one careful sentence at a time, through the corridor when they passed near each other. The Velkari medical consultants used a protocol log. The log was administrative. The log was connected. She asked Fenwick, through a note carried by one of the other Level 2 workers who passed his level twice a week for supply transfer, about facility infrastructure, load tolerances, structural integration. He answered in a note that she had to decode because he had, without being told to, encrypted it in what he apparently thought was a subtle manner. It was not subtle. She decoded it in 4 minutes, but the information was good. She did not ask Brackett. She waited for Brackett to reach her. He did on a morning in late winter, through the only method she hadn't anticipated. He was transferred to archive duty. He came in with a group of new workers, none of whom she recognized, all of them blinking in the relative brightness after level 3. He was taller than she'd imagined from the sound of his breathing through the grates. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and a way of moving that was very still and very aware simultaneously. He looked at the room the way she had looked at it on her first day, cataloging, not reacting. He found her panel on the second pass. He did not acknowledge her. He sat at the panel 3 stations down from hers, took up his tool and began to work. 2 hours later, in the brief window when the administrator stepped away for the meal preparation cycle, he said, not looking at her, his voice pitched at a frequency just above the ambient hum of the archive systems. The girl who moves pieces. She kept her eyes on her panel. I don't know what you mean. The transfer on level 9, he said. The fault in the cell door, I was on level 4. I could see it in the maintenance dispatch pattern. A pause. I've been waiting to see who generated it. How did you identify me? Process of elimination, he said, and the way you sit on the floor instead of the platform. She thought about this. What does that tell you? That you're still thinking like someone who hasn't been captured, he said. Everyone else sits on the platform because the platform is there. You sit on the floor because you're mapping the room. A silence. "What do you want?" she said. "To be useful," he said, "in whatever direction you're moving." She thought about her mother. The moment of doubt before you commit, don't skip it. She didn't skip it. She sat with it for 2 full days. She watched him work. She watched him interact with the administrators, exactly the right level of compliance, exactly the right level of neutrality, nothing that would flag, nothing that would attract. He was good. He had been doing what she was doing in the dark of his own cell with the tools available to him, which were fewer than hers but not nothing. On the 3rd day, she said to the space between them, "I need you to learn a notation system. I'm going to teach it to you in the archive margins." He said, "I'm ready." Spring came to the stripe of sky in Sierra's window. The bronze gave way to something cleaner. She watched it change every morning before work, those few minutes standing at the slit in the rock, her face angled to catch whatever light came through. She thought of it as the one thing she kept for herself, not a tactic, not a tool, just a window, just sky. She thought about her parents, about the dinner table arguments and the 3 languages, and the word her father used to say in the engineering lab when a solution worked: elegant. He meant something specific by it, not beautiful exactly, but something that had found the shortest path through a complex space, something that was right in the way that fit. What she was building felt slowly, like it was becoming that. The tribunal inquiry system required a formal complaint submitted in writing in the face register. Scene had identified the submission protocol from the Velkari medical consultation logs, where it was referenced as a comparison case for procedural standards. Fenwick had identified, from the infrastructure notes he was quietly encoding and passing to her, 2 transit corridors in the facility that corresponded to external communication relay points. Brackett had identified, through archive work on Velkari administrative history, a precedent case, a complaint from a Threen labor facility 20 years ago, which had generated a full tribunal review and resulted in the facility being placed under monitoring. The complaint had succeeded because it had been submitted simultaneously through 3 separate channels, making it impossible to intercept all 3 before the 48-hour auto-escalation triggered. She needed the language to write the complaint. She had the language. She needed the submission pathway. Fenwick's corridor notes gave her the relay points, terminals that were technically archive-adjacent, part of the facility communication backbone, accessible through the same deletion log system she had been working with for months. She needed the precedent language, the specific construction in the face register that would force the Empire to respond rather than bury. Brackett had found it in the archive history. He had encoded it in his deletion log margins with the notation system she had taught him, and she had decoded it, and she had read it 3 times, and she had thought, yes, that, exactly that. She needed something she did not have. Documentation. The complaint needed to be specific. Names, dates, classification numbers, the specific processing orders that had been issued against specific prisoners. The kind of evidence that made a tribunal inquiry undeniable. She had some of it her own classification record, the fragments she had decoded from the wall inscriptions, the administrative overhead she had caught from overheard conversations. But it wasn't enough. Not enough to force a response. Not enough to be the thing that couldn't be ignored. She thought about this for 2 weeks. She thought about it in the archive, moving through her own history, deleting logos, encoding her maintenance notations, building the complaint in the margins of the system in small, invisible pieces, while the administrators walked past and the other workers deleted their logos, and the Velkari civilization continued to believe, with its comfortable certainty, that everything of importance was already known. The answer was in the archive itself. Of course it was. The archive didn't just contain human media. It contained the processing records for the archive, every intake document, every worker classification, every administrative note generated during the collection and reconstruction of the data. The Velkari hadn't separated their administrative data from the archive data when they built the system. Why would they? The archive workers were Category 3 labor. They were not supposed to be able to read the administrative language. They were not supposed to understand what they were looking at. She spent the last week of winter going through her panel with systematic care, not erasing logos, but reading everything in the administrative margin text of every segment she had access to, reading it with 4 months of self-taught Velkari and 2 additional months of immersion in the administrative idiom of the archive system, and she found what she needed in fragments, spread across dozens of segments: names, classification numbers, dates, processing orders. Not just for Allah, for others, many others. She encoded them all. On the last morning of winter, by her count, which had become precise enough that she trusted it, she sat at her panel and she built the complaint. She built it in the deletion log, in the maintenance notations, in the face register Velkari that she had assembled piece by piece from 6 months of wall reading and margin study and overheard conversation, and the archive itself. She built it in the cipher that was not a cipher, the bilingual gap that would look like standard procedure to a Velkari reader, and that would route, through 3 separate relay points in the communication backbone, to the tribunal's submission queue. She submitted it. Then she picked up her tool. She found the next logo, a tech company from the early 22nd century, its mark embedded in the upper corner of a street view reconstruction. She deleted it. She kept working. She did not allow herself to hope. Hope was not a strategy. Hope was the thing you let in after the work was done, after the piece had moved and the board had changed, and you had done everything it was possible to do. Until then, you worked. You kept your face blank. You answered to your number with the correct click and the falling tone. You sat on the floor instead of the platform, and you mapped the room, and you did not let them see that you were doing it. She was still doing this, 3 days after the submission, 4 or 5, when the administrator came in with 2 guards. Her hands did not shake. She had prepared for this. She had gone through every branch of the logic, every possible failure mode, and she had prepared for each one, and this was one of them, that the submission had been detected and traced, and the response was not an inquiry but a reclassification. She set down her tool, she stood up, she held her hands where they could be seen. But the administrator walked past her. He went to Scene's station. He said something. Scene looked up. Her face went through several things very quickly, and then settled into the same neutrality that everyone in the facility wore, the neutrality of people who had learned to keep their inner life invisible. She went with them. Sira sat back down. She picked up her tool. She gave it another day to understand what had happened, moving every piece of information she could gather, decoding every administrative fragment she could access. By the end of the day, she had it. Scene had been identified as the source. Not by the submission had routed cleanly all 3 channels, but by a different flag, an older one, a medical consultation log anomaly that the Velkari had been sitting on for weeks. Scene had been cooperating in a way that the administrators had found useful, and then she had stopped cooperating in a way that had been noticed, and the flag had escalated. Scene had known. Sira thought about the way she had moved through the facility in the days since being recruited, the careful sentences, the quiet compliance that was not quite compliance. She had known she was flagged. She had helped anyway. Sira sat with this. She sat with it the way she had sat with everything else in this facility, in the dark, on the floor, turning it over, feeling the weight of it, not letting herself be crushed by it. Then she built the second complaint. This one included Scene. This one included the medical consultation log anomaly that had been used to reflag her, which was itself a procedural violation under the tribunal standards for protected status witnesses. She had the language for it. She had found the precedent in Brackett's archive research. There was a subclause in the tribunal's procedural code, a provision that existed specifically because one of the 32 species under previous occupation had used informant status as a mechanism to identify and eliminate witnesses before inquiries could be completed. The Velkari had not updated their compliance documents to account for that subclause. She did not know if this was oversight or arrogance. She suspected it was both. She submitted the second complaint through 2 channels instead of 3, because the third had been shut down after the first submission. She had noted the termination in the deletion log metadata and adapted. 2 channels was enough for the auto-escalation. She knew the procedure now. Spring, the archive, the logos, the work. She turned 17 somewhere in the middle of spring, by her count. She did not tell anyone. She sat at her panel and deleted a logo from a sports advertisement from a century ago and thought about her parents and what they would think of her right now. And she decided her mother would be deeply alarmed and deeply proud simultaneously, and her father would say, "Elegant." The first response from the tribunal arrived 11 days after the second submission. She didn't see it directly. She had no direct access to the tribunal communication feed. She knew it had arrived because of the response in the facility, the change in the administrator's movement patterns, the shift in the neck-marking colors of the 2 senior overseers, the arrival of an external team, 3 Velkari she had not seen before, wearing classification markings she had to work hard to decode, and when she did she recognized them, audit designations, internal compliance auditors. Not a reclassification team, not security auditors. She deleted a logo. She kept her face blank. Brackett at his panel 3 stations down said nothing, but his left hand, which was resting on the panel edge between deletion strokes, opened briefly. Fingers spread flat for 1 second, then closed. A small gesture. She had learned over the weeks that it meant, "I see it. I understand." She gave him the same gesture back. The auditors spent 4 days in the facility. She watched what she could observe of their movement patterns. She encoded what she could access in the maintenance notations. She continued to work. On the 5th day, they brought Scene back. Not to level 9, to the archive. A different station at the far end of the room. The administrator who brought her said nothing. Scene sat down. She picked up her tool. She began to delete logos. Across the length of the archive, they did not look at each other. But it was there between them anyway, the specific, complicated warmth of something that had been worth the cost. The inquiry would take months. The tribunal process was slow. She knew this. She had read the precedent cases. She understood that the auditor's presence was the beginning, not the end, that what came after would be more waiting, more patience, more small, careful acts in the margins of a system that did not know it was being used. She was prepared for this. She had been preparing for 6 months. What she had not prepared for, what she had not allowed herself to imagine, because imagining it would have made it a thing she needed, and need was dangerous, was the message from the advocate office. It came through the tribunal communication feed, accessed through the archive relay point, decoded from the face register by the girl at panel 7 who had spent 6 months learning how. It was short. It was formal. It used the specific construction she had identified in Brackett's research, the one that could not be buried or rerouted. It said, "Inquiry confirmed. Facility under provisional monitoring. All prisoner classification actions suspended pending review. Human Advocate Office requesting direct contact with the source of submission. Designation: the prisoner in archive section, category 4, subdesignation 7. 47. She sat at her panel. She held her deletion tool. She looked at the reconstruction in front of her. A 23rd century street, its signs and vehicles and ordinary human faces going about their ordinary lives. And she looked at the logo she was supposed to erase, a small commercial mark in the corner of a sign, belonging to some enterprise long dissolved, and she thought about erasing it. She left it there. She set her tool down flat on the panel edge, and she took a breath and she let herself feel it. The thing she had not allowed herself to feel for 6 months. The thing that was not a strategy and not a tactic and not a tool. The thing that was just hers, just human, just the specific warmth of knowing that in the dark and the cold and the imposed forgetting, she had not lost the thread of who she was. She had refused to lose it, that was all. She had simply refused. Brackett's hand opened on the panel edge, fingers spread, held for a moment. She opened her hand beside his. She did not look at him, he did not look at her. Somewhere in the facility, Allah was alive. Somewhere Scene was at her station with her quiet, guilty competence, which was not guilty anymore, or at least less so. Somewhere old Fenwick was in his fugue, but there were auditors in the building now, and the classification actions were suspended, and the small piece of infrastructure knowledge he had encoded in a poorly encrypted note was sitting in the margins of an archive log, waiting to be useful when the next piece needed to move. She picked up her tool. She looked at the logo she had decided to leave. She thought, no, not yet, not until every one of the names she had documented was out of level 9, not until the board was different enough to matter, not until the thing was finished, or as finished as things in this kind of fight ever were. She left the logo there as a marker, a reminder, a small private sign to herself that she was still here, still thinking, still building towards something. Then she went back to work. Outside, through the stripe of sky in her cell window, spring was moving towards summer. The light was changing. It was warmer. She could feel it even through 3 feet of stone, that particular softening in the air that meant the world beyond the cliff face was doing what it always did regardless of occupations or dungeons, or the comfortable certainties of civilizations that thought they had already accounted for everything. She was 17 years old. Her name was Sira. She had not said it aloud in 8 months. She would say it again. She knew this with the same cold certainty she had brought to every calculation in this place. Not today, maybe not for months, but she would say it in the face register, to the advocate's representative, in the language of the system that had tried to erase her, and she would say it so precisely and so correctly that there would be no gap between the word and the weight of it. Until then, the work, the tool, the logos, the small erasing hands of the people who had been made into ghosts in their own history and who were becoming, one careful margin notation at a time, something else. Something harder to erase.